sad and depressing, and I'm also sort of sorry, but I'm also not super sorry because I'm really taking this straight out of the book here. But it will go that way, and hopefully it'll help us to kind of explore some ideas that are important to understand, but are also difficult to wrap our heads around sometimes. And so that's really where it's going to go. But I'm going to give you the warning right out, and it doesn't feel overly joyful. I know that. There you go. So this morning we're going to be doing a bit of reading out of the Psalms. We're going to be in Psalm number 88. If you guys want to grab your Bibles and open it up, it is one of the few that, normally when we're in the Psalms, we're hearing these great prayers and these great songs, and they're always reminiscent of, they'll come back and give, a glory to God, or thank God for, what He has done, or for His interaction with us, or an acknowledgement that, God is great in some capacity. And this is one that sadly doesn't do that, and it's one of the very few that doesn't do that. But it's going to kind of help us see some important lessons. So I'm going to be reading Psalm number 88. It says, Lord, you are the God who saves me. Day and night I cry out to you. May my prayer come before you. Turn your eyes to hear my cry. I'm overwhelmed with trouble in my life, and my life draws near to death. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like one without strength. I'm set apart with the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, who are cut off from your care. You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths. Your wrath lies heavy on me. You've overwhelmed me with all your waves. You have taken my closest friends. You have made me repulsive to them. I am confined and cannot escape. My eyes are dim with grief. I call on you, Lord, every day. I spread out my hands to you. Do you show your wonders to the dead? Do their spirits rise up and praise you? Is your love declared to the grave, your faithfulness in destruction? Are your wonders known in the places of darkness? Or are your righteous deeds in the land of oblivion? But I cry to you, Lord, for help. In the morning my prayer comes before you. Why, Lord, do you reject me and hide your face from me? From my youth I have suffered and been close to death. I have borne your terrors, and I am in despair. Your wrath has swept over me. Your terrors have destroyed me. All day long they surround me like a flood. They have completely engulfed me. You have taken my friend and neighbor, darkness, my closest friend. Really nothing to come from on that. It doesn't bring it up. And so, since this is such a rarity, this psalm and then Psalm 39 is really of the few that have this. I'm beat down and I'm worn out. And my darkness is my suffering and my pain and this feeling of abandonment, and how darkness is my closest friend. And darkness seems to be the theme that's come in here, which is why I've titled this one Darkness. So darkness is really representative of that suffering and that pain and all of that you're going to experience in your life. And it may make you wonder why. I mean, Psalms is a very long book. Why include this one? Why did this need to be here? And I think there's a couple of reasons. Of course, there's lessons to be learned from this, and we're going to talk about some of those. But I think more than anything else, it's an excellent representation of the fact that God knows that when we are in despair, when we are in suffering, when we are in pain, sometimes this is how you feel. This is sometimes what it leads you to. And He's not going to sugarcoat it and tell you, it's not, like, as much as I would love, life to work out basically like the entire book of Proverbs of you do good things and good things happen to you, and that's how it is. Anybody who's lived for any number of years is going to quickly realize that's probably not the case. Bad stuff happens. And you will feel like this, and it's okay to see that somebody felt like this too. If anybody ever got into this Christianity walk of life and chose to follow Christ and thought that, oh good, now I'm a Christian, it's all going to be fine. No, it doesn't work like that. And I think this psalm is there to acknowledge and accept the reality of what living in this life is going to be. And sometimes you're going to go through this. But some of the lessons we can see here, darkness can last for a very long time. Even in this, in verse 15, he says, from my youth I have suffered and been close to death. This is something that's clearly for this writer has been going on for a while. And your suffering can last for a while. It doesn't mean that God isn't there. It doesn't mean that he's not faithful. It doesn't mean that your life isn't going to be, better, even if it's on the other side of that resurrection. It can last for a long time. And that doesn't take away the reality of what Christ is and what he's done for us. Luckily, darkness can allow us to more clearly see the reality of God's grace. You don't really see, and you won't really be able to appreciate the reality of what God's grace can be for you until you're really truly at a point where you need to see God's grace. And so being in that pit of darkness is sometimes the best place to experience God's grace. And luckily, littered throughout this song, we get to see what I think is probably our most appropriate approach to how you move forward when you're in that pit of despair. And we see it in verses 1 and 2, in verse 9, and in verse 13, where he says, Lord, you are my God, you save me day and night. May my prayer come before you, and turn your ears to my cry. In verse 9, my eyes have grown deep. I call to you, Lord, every day. I spread out my hands to you. In verse 13, but I cry to you for help, Lord. In the morning, my prayer comes before you. Drawing yourself near to God is the appropriate response for when you're in suffering. It is not the obvious or the natural response, but it is the appropriate response. And one of the great analogies I've seen is, when you're praying and drawing yourself near to God, it's like a boat that's moored to a dock, and you pull on that rope, and it draws it closer. But the important thing to remember here is, in that analogy, you are not the dock. So you pull on that rope, and you're going to draw yourself near to a steadfast God, not the other way around. God isn't necessarily there to come and fix all of your problems, to take away that suffering. You may have suffering, and it may last a while, but you're going to pull on that rope and draw yourself near to God. And that is the appropriate response, and littered throughout here. No matter the suffering this writer is going through, no matter the darkness that he is in, he's taking the time every day to pull on that rope and draw himself near to God. Heavy. Just awesome. But I told you all that, so I can tell you guys a little story. I'm good. So a couple years ago, I got a little sick. I had an ear infection. And so I ended up seeing an ENT. I went to a primary care guy. I saw him a lot. And my ear infection got worse, and I ended up having weird pains that just hurt. They would be there for a day and they would go away. As slender as I look now, I was about 45 to 50 pounds less than this. I shriveled up a little bit. I got lots of lab tests, lots and lots of labs. And at one point, my doctor took an x-ray of my chest and said, "You have pneumonia. It's not a man cold," her words. So I get to go to the hospital. So I'm in the hospital, and some of the other labs that he had drawn were still coming back. And I got to meet a pulmonologist. And he came in and, let me go back a little bit. So in the midst of all this happening, I did the thing that you shouldn't do. And I don't do it, but I did it. I Googled my symptoms. And the only thing that came up was one guy who said, "Oh, I had this really weird rare disease." And I looked it up, and it's a 90% mortality rate in 2 years. And I'm like, no, that's not it. Something else. But this pulmonologist comes into my hospital room and he gets this lab test back and he says, you have this rare disease. He's like, we're gonna get a biopsy to confirm it, but you have it. And I looked at him and I probably lost the color in my face, I'm sure. I mean, whatever little color was there to start with. And he says, do you know what that is? And then I had to explain to him, yeah, I Googled my symptoms, don't do that. But I did. And what it also meant is I knew where my road was going. It's an autoimmune condition, you don't come out of it. It lasts forever, so there's a darkness that's gonna last a long time. But it also gave me a moment to realize that I can take this response. And I was able to really seize this feeling and draw closer to God. I have never studied my Bible harder than I have in these last few years. I have never worked so hard and immersed myself in God in the way that I could. Now, the reality that this pulmonologist came in was a sign of God's grace that I couldn't expect and you couldn't plan it. But he happened to also have a fellowship that he completed in Minnesota, exactly for the kinds of diseases I have. He is not here anymore. He has moved on to bigger and better things because he should have. But he was on staff, and he was the guy who saw my result and saw my x-ray and ordered that, and he just came in and he knew. Because he had that expertise of this reasonably rare disease that has a very long name that I don't have to say. But he was there. And to experience God's grace that way was something that, even though this thing is forever for me, and it is, when I hit rock bottom, it was very clear to see what God's grace can also do for me. Now, fortunately, so you guys know I'm not about to die. There's treatments for it, and so if I was in the 70s, I'd be in a big, bad place, but it's not the 70s, and I'm gonna be okay. But being at that rock bottom spot, even though it's gonna last a while, and I'm going to hurt, and I'm going to get treatments forever, it was the most amazing place to see God's grace, no matter how dark it felt at that moment. So it's really a matter of what's your next step. So is your next step to call out to God, to draw close to God, to pull on that rope and bring yourself close to Him? It's a matter of being faithful. And I want to talk a little bit about faith. Because it's a concept that I think, as I've studied it and I've delved into it, that it has changed a little bit. And so maybe it's for everybody, maybe it's just me. But I've always really associated the idea of what is faith to something very close to what is my belief. What's my conviction? It's something more internalized more than anything else. And as I studied faith more and more, I found that associating the idea of faith to belief is maybe not as accurate as it could be to other concepts. And now, of course, the best place to go for learning about faith and faithful people is in Hebrews chapter 11. So let's look at it real quick. This is what we call the Faithful Hall of Fame, right? That's what it's called. So, the book of Hebrews is, what did I say there? Okay, it's kind of my jam. So, I don't know if that's a term people use anymore, but I still use it. So, the book of Hebrews is fantastic. I would spend months up here talking to you guys about Hebrews. I absolutely dig it. And I like it because so much mystery is around it, and so much of the backstory and context that we can have in some of these New Testament letters you don't really get in Hebrews, because we don't really know who wrote the book of Hebrews, and we also don't really know who he wrote it to. And so there's a whole lot of backstory context that you can't get, and so you have to take the letter and read into it just what's there. And I think that is an exciting place to approach one of the letters. It's very unique that way. But I'm going to try to break down and get to what I think is the overarching theme of the book of Hebrews, and it has long-standing become probably my favorite verse, and we're gonna get there. But I'm gonna go back to chapter 10 real fast. So Hebrews chapter 10, this is where we get kind of a little glimpse, not necessarily of who these people were that were reading this letter, but what they were going through. And in Hebrews chapter 10, I'm just going to read verse 32. It says, "Remember those early days when you had received the light, when you had endured in a great conflict full of suffering. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insults and persecution. At other times you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. So don't throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded." So this letter, up until this point, we get a real solid just back and forth comparison of Jesus and what he was and what he did, and that direct comparison to basically everything held sacred in Judaism. And it's just a long-standing back and forth between, the law that was given and the tabernacle itself and the priesthood and, Mount Sinai, comparing it to Mount Zion. And it's just this non-stop back and forth of, here's what you had in Judaism and here's how Jesus is just better. And it's methodical in the way it goes through it. And it is like every Old Testament reference is basically just every other word in there. It's just huge through it. But we get to this point, we get the description of why are we telling these people this thing? And it seems that there's a group of people who have been falling back and giving up on Christ and giving up on Christianity for probably the ease of what was their life in Judaism and the community they came out of. To become a Christian and to leave that behind was a lot. And these people were having a problem with it. And so they're getting put in prison and they're getting their possessions taken away from them. They're probably being rejected by their family. And it's a letter to encourage them to say, don't give up. And in chapter 11, we see that faithful hall of fame. And the idea that strikes me the most comes from verse 13. So this faithful hall of fame, it's people that anyone really entrenched in Judaism, these were probably like your heroes. These were the people you learned about growing up. These were those who you would look up to and say, if I could live a life like these people, this was the people who just, the richness of your tradition was wrapped up into. But it says in verse 13, just in the midst of all these people, it says, "And these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth." So faithfulness, not necessarily an idea of belief, but a word that I find that maybe is a bit closer to it is the idea of something that is trustworthy or something that can be trusted. It's like if you're standing on a staircase and all you can really see is the next step. You may not know where that staircase goes, but if you can trust that that next step is going to hold you and that that staircase is going to lead you where you want to go, then you're going to take that next step. And that is the idea of what faith is. It's not something that step's going to hold me, I'm going to wait right here. Like, I believe that step. I totally believe that step is going to hold me, but I'm still going to wait right here. No. Faith is, I believe that step is going to hold me. I trust it with all of my weight. I'm going to step onto it. And there may be darkness beyond that step. You don't know. But you're going to trust that that next one is going to hold you. And that is an idea of faith. It's something that they reasoned and considered and thought through and said, I trust that step with my next step. And then, so gloriously, this wraps it up. And so the theme of this whole book, you actually see in chapter 12. So it talks a little bit about, in verse 4, I love this, it says, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And you completely forgotten the word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son. So these people, like, okay, fine, you've been thrown in jail. Okay, you've had your things taken away. You had to go be with people who were arrested for simply being a Christian. And this is hard. Boo-hoo. It's not like anybody's killing you. And that's really the theme that's coming here. He's telling them, you haven't yet gone to the point that you've had to shed your blood. And in verse 12, just the greatest, is therefore strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. That is the biblical equivalent of suck it up, buttercup. Yes, your life is hard. And I mean, what a more important lesson than the we can embrace. I mean, how hard is my life? Okay, fine, I have this autoimmune condition and I have to get infusions every so often. How tough is it really? Suck it up, buttercup. That next step will hold you. This book has methodically torn through all this information to tell you that you are going to be just fine. And that next step is a step worth trusting on. Suck it up. I love it. But here's where the real reality comes in. So, we're going to experience darkness in your life. You are going to have pain. You are going to feel abandoned. You're going to feel sometimes like you're on your own. There is no doubt about it. Jesus said, people are going to hate you. They hated me first. Sometimes that suffering is going to feel unfair. It's going to feel like it's something you didn't deserve. And of course it is. Why wouldn't it be? Jesus hung on a cross. If it happened to him, what makes you think you don't deserve it too? But the reality is that Jesus took the real burden. He experienced the real darkness. He was really abandoned. When he said, Ali, Ali, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? He was forsaken, so that you and I only sometimes will feel forsaken. But you're not going to, because you have a God who is faithful. He's trustworthy, and he will support that next step. But when we're in our dark moments, are you going to pull on the rope and bring yourself closer to the dark? Are you going to look at that next step and say, I don't know what's at the bottom of this staircase, but this next step is going to hold me? And then take that next step. Because that's where your support is going to come.